The Toledo Strip, a seemingly inconsequential piece of land, but it ignited some serious tension. This wedge of swamp and forest land were hotly contested by Michigan and Ohio. This was the 1880s, my friend, where diplomatic methods took a backseat to, shall we say, more assertive methods. It was a classic case of talking the talk, but often not walking the walk, with militias that seemed as much a danger to themselves as they were to the enemy. Some say that the Toledo War is still part of Michigan and Ohio's culture almost 2 centuries later, with a gridiron rivalry between the University of Michigan and Ohio State University. This is one of our most requested subjects to do a video on. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking. Let's dig into this story.
The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established an east-west line drawn from the southern tip of Lake Michigan across the base of the peninsula. The original line was drawn using the Mitchell map that showed the line intersecting Lake Erie north of the Maumee River. This is the line that Ohioans recognized when their Constitution was drafted in 1803 and what they used in their application for statehood. When the Michigan Territory was created in 1805, surveyors realized that the tip of Lake Michigan was actually further south and included Toledo. Michigan used that language in the 1787 ordinance.
So it's 1817, and U.S. Surveyor General and former Ohio Governor Edward Tiffin sends out William Harris to survey the northern border of Ohio according to language in Ohio's Constitution. Then Lewis Cass, the Michigan Territorial Governor, goes to President Monroe and says, hey, they're surveying according to their Constitution, but the original Northwest Territory said something different, so they can't do that.
We should follow the line that Dad said. But I told Dad that the line was in a different spot, and he never said anything. Dad! Ohio is trying to change the line, but I think we should use the line that you said. Well, Father, I am a state kid. Michigan is just a territory kid. I can vote for you in the best father competition. She can't. Ah! Ah!
So Michigan's like, fine. So they go out and they hire another surveyor, John A. Fulton, and they have him survey a line according to the language in the Northwest Ordinance. And what they find is that the line that he surveys is 5 miles south of Harris's line on the west end and 8 miles south on the east end. And that line put Toledo squarely in Michigan. And you know, that was a problem because that 468 square miles of land was not only swampland, but it also, there was going to be a lot of economic activity from that little port town. So both sides wanted it because, you know, money. So then Michigan decides to quietly just enter the territory and set up shop. They set up local governments, they work on local infrastructure, and generally they just kind of walk around like they own the place. And here in Erie, Michigan is where the headquarters was. But Ohio kept passing resolutions saying that the land was theirs. And things get wild at this point with laws, bills, and politicians running around. There's some saber rattling, some one-upmanship, and there's just too many details for a YouTube video. But here's the short version. Michigan tried to become a state in 1834, but Ohio congressmen successfully blocked their bid to become a state. Then Michigan gets a new territorial governor who's 23 years old, Stephen Mason, and reports are he was quite a hothead. So Ohio's Governor George Lucas refuses to negotiate with Michigan over the matter. And then Michigan's territorial government passed the Pains and Penalty Act, where they could penalize anyone from the Toledo Strip and also arrest them and throw them in jail. And not to be outdone, Ohio's governor passes a resolution to extend Ohio's county borders into the Toledo Strip, and Michigan responds by holding elections in the Strip on April Fool's Day. So now it's 1835 and things start to heat up. Ohio appropriates $300,000 to raise a militia, and Michigan counters by passing a bill raising $315,000 to raise a militia. And on April 9th, a Michigan sheriff leads a posse into Ohio to arrest some Ohio officials, and Ohio newspapers said that the Ohio flag was torn down, it was dragged through the streets, and it was burned. Mustered Ohio militia started heading north to Perrysburg to rally, but many of them got caught and thrashed around in the Great Black Swamp. And we'll have more about the Great Black Swamp in a video later. And this is an example of what the Great Black Swamp was like. So this is what they would have faced as they headed north. No wonder they got waylaid in a huge swamp. It all sounds a little surreal and ridiculous, but there was a real threat of civil war. So a couple weeks later, Ohio again sends out a survey team to resurvey the line according to their specifications. So they send out a survey party of about 40 to start resurveying the line again. Upon hearing this, Michigan's General Brown led a party of 60 Wolverine partisans and found the survey team here relaxing. And it was called the Battle of Phillips Corner. When they found the surveyors fled.
So as they're running away, the Wolverines fired shots in the air. And then after an awkward standoff at a cabin, they arrested 9 surveyors.
And they took them back to Monroe County, and they put them in jail, and then most of them were released on bond. So understand that these militias weren't professional soldiers. They were just ordinary citizens that had a hankering for raising some cane and tying up hands. They were just riding around with rifles, spitting tobacco, and generally doing misdeeds in the name of principles. But then came the bloodshed.
In July, Sheriff Wood and his posse came into a tavern to arrest 2 Stickney. That's right, his name was 2 Stickney. A scuffle ensued, and 2 Stickney took out a penknife and stabbed the sheriff. 2 Stickney was the son of Benjamin Franklin Stickney, who named his other son 1 Stickney. His daughter was named Indiana. Names, I guess, were different back then. And to honor those Stickneys, they've named a road here in Toledo.
Interestingly, at the home cemetery, 2 Stickney is buried, but none of the other Stickneys are buried here. And rumor has it that his father was taken from the graveyard by grave robbers, and 2 doctors were charged with that. And then the Ohio governor announced a court session to establish Ohio's rights to the land. So Michigan responded by gathering 1,200 militiamen to come to Toledo to prevent that from happening. But Ohio tricked them, because Ohio held the session at midnight and they were out of there by 1 a.m. And when the Michiganders got there the next day, nobody was there, so they just kind of rode around town and caused a little trouble. So at this point, civil war is dangerously close, and President Andrew Jackson, a bit of a hothead himself, had Stephen Mason, the Michigan territorial governor, removed because of his aggressive use of militia. But it's funny, because the Michiganians had him voted back into his post almost immediately. But then tempers cooled a bit. So the feds moved to settle the dispute, and Michigan was offered in compensation statehood, as well as the western 2/3 of the Upper Peninsula. But Michigan declined that offer, and apparently the Ann Arbor delegation was the most vocal.
Finally, on December 14th, 1836, Michigan accepted the compromises. Michigan let go of the Toledo Strip.
It was admitted as the 26th state in the Union, and Toledo and Maumee became a part of Ohio. And then Michigan newspapers set about complaining about this perpetually snowy wasteland to the north that they had gotten in the settlement. But for the 498 square miles of the Toledo Strip, they got 9,000 square miles of the Upper Peninsula. But the rivalry wasn't over with yet. The border was still disputed until 1915, until the government did yet another official survey of the border. Michigan and Ohio's governors shook hands at the border over Post 70 on the Lost Peninsula. And we're currently on the Lost Peninsula waiting for totality. And stay tuned, because we're going to do another video of the Lost Peninsula, but this is Post 70 on the Lost Peninsula that marks the border.
Michigan, Ohio.
But there's still disagreement about Turtle Island, which is out in Lake Erie. And that's yet another upcoming video.
Then in 1965, the lieutenant governors of Michigan and Ohio stood in the same spot and shook hands over the state line.
And a lot of references say that they affixed a plaque that said, "Good borders make good neighbors," but that's the 50th anniversary plaque, but we didn't see a plaque that says that on marker 70. And maybe it's somewhere else. To be sure, the OSU and U of M rivalry still seems to mark a psychological spot in the minds of the citizens of both states. But the story isn't quite finished yet. You see that piece of worthless, perpetually snow-covered land that Michigan got? Well, in 1844, surveyors noticed that the compass needles on their compasses were spinning around in circles, which could mean a few things, but back then it meant that there was a huge iron ore deposit. Oh yeah, and they kept running into this thing called copper floating on the surface. And they found out that there was a lot of copper. And the Upper Peninsula actually created more mineral wealth than the state of California during the California Gold Rush. That's the story so far. There's so much to talk about. The Lost Peninsula, Turtle Island, the Great Black Swamp, but we'll get to that soon. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
From the Lost Peninsula just before totality of the eclipse. That's the story. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you soon.